Um, Hello, everybody. Welcome to the CMT2A breakout session. My name's Paul August. I'm on the board of directors for the CMTRF and also the Scientific Advisory Board. Today, I would like to welcome Dr. Mario Saporta. So he is the professor of neurology and human genetics at the University of Miami Miller School of Medicine. And he's also the medical director of the University of Miami CMT Center of Excellence. Dr. Saporta conducts both clinical and translational research in CMT. He is the North American principal investigator for the FARNEX Premier trial, and he leads a research lab that's focused on developing and applying human cellular models of CMT for drug discovery and validation of genetic therapies. So thank you, Dr. Saporta, for being here.
Thank you, Paul. So welcome, everybody. The idea that I had for this session is really to keep it as informal as possible and to really answer the questions that you may have about CMT2A. I have some slides just to help illustrate things if we need to go through a more complex concept, but I'd just like to start by kind of opening the session for specific questions that you may have. If everybody's too shy, then we may go through a more formal presentation, but I think it's more probably productive if we have kind of a conversation instead of a formal talk. So that goes for the people on Zoom. If you have any questions, feel free to start asking them. I'm not sure if I can see. Okay, all right, let's get started. Yeah.
So my husband was diagnosed in 2005 with the MFN2 mutation. So one question I had was, should he have another test for diagnosis since it was so long ago? Like, are there better, how accurate, I guess, is the diagnosis from 2005? Is it change over time? Does it reduce some genetic testing?
So it really depends on what specific mutation was found. If it's a known, like a fusion 2 mutation, the diagnosis is made. There's no need to repeat with new testing because it's not new testing. What we have nowadays is faster, cheaper, and more comprehensive ways to inquire the DNA for an answer. But in his case, what we had back in 2005 was enough to provide that answer. So I would just make sure that if you go to the report, it says pathogenic variant, which means that this is a variant that we know is associated with CMT2A. And that's enough to confirm the diagnosis.
Pathogenic?
Yeah, pathogenic, which means disease causing.
Okay, and they said this was de novo too, like they tested his parents,
Yeah.
couldn't find anything. So
Right.
they didn't know if they target that same gene, if it came from them, or if they could have another mutation, not an MFN2, but that isn't caused by MFN. Should they have inherited it, but they just didn't?
No, so if they provide information, okay, the parents have not carried this mutation, they can only do that if they sequence the gene, just like they did for him. And usually if they know where to look, meaning the gene and the specific variant, they can be very specific to look into other family members. So
Mutation they would have potentially would cause the MFN2 mutation. They had MFN2 mutation causes MFN2 mutation.
So
I'm just curious if it's a de novo case, it seems kind of odd.
it's not odd, actually, it's no. So for the depending on the CMT type, it can go up to almost a third of patients have de novo mutations, meaning that mutation happened very early during their development, and then cause the disease in their body, instead of a mutation that happens later in life and only affects a very specific group of cells, and that's what cancer basically is. A de novo mutation happens in the very early stages of the development of a baby, and does affect the whole body. So the fact that he has a de novo mutation because it was determined that the parents were not affected, it's not actually that uncommon or that unprecedented. And if they did the right analysis, which by 2005, they were very capable of doing, and were able to determine that there's no mutation, and I assume that the parents are also asymptomatic, they don't have CMT, I think that's enough to kind of close the case. Don't need to reopen the case,
And it's
in a
all
sense.
MFN2 mutation, is it all dominant as far as like inheriting or giving your children? Are they all dominant?
So the majority of mitofusion 2 mutations that cause CMT are inherited in an autosomal dominant way. There are now more cases where we recognize what we call either a compound heterozygote, meaning a person that has 2 different mutations on each copy of the gene, and that's enough to develop CMT2A. But that's kind of the exception and not the rule. So for most cases, and again, it depends on the specific mutation, most cases of CMT2A are inherited in an autosomal dominant way.
One doctor told us that their kids had no chance of getting it, another doctor said 50% chance of getting it. So I don't know what to look at to say what the answer is.
So it's the genetic testing report that will answer that. Because since 2005, we have learned a lot about mitofusion variants. So in most likelihood, we should, let me see if I can mute. I'm just going to mute everybody, and then we will open to questions maybe. Can I? Yeah, okay. So nowadays, there are still some variants that we can't make a determination, but in most cases, we know by looking at the variant, whether it's an autosomal dominant variant or not, or if it's one of the few variants that have been identified as a different type of inheritance. So just as a generalization, in all likelihood, it is a 50-50% risk, again, depending on the variant, but most likely. And how old are your kids?
18 to 17.
Okay, so they're getting to an age that they could make a decision if they want to be tested or not. And that would be the most straightforward way to determine whether they are at risk or not. And also for 2A, if you have an idea of when you start presenting symptoms and what those symptoms were, you can always look at them and see if you're seeing the same. Because for most mutations, you have a kind of a clinical picture that's pretty evident by childhood or teenager years, that by that age, if they're not presenting symptoms, it starts to decrease the likelihood. But the only way to be 100% sure is by testing them. Yeah. Okay.
Or maybe we could ask online if there's anybody else that has
Yeah.
questions too, as we start.
Yeah, so that was I was trying to when I was starting to say is that anybody that's on Zoom that wants to ask a question, you just unmute yourself, and we're happy to answer those questions.
Hi, this is Gloria.
Hello.
I have scoliosis that's pretty severe along with CMT, and I have compromised lung capacity. And I heard it mentioned earlier that the mitochondria can be affected, that can decrease oxygen to the axon. My CMT didn't really progress until I got into my 50s, and then it has progressed kind of steadily. So I'm wondering if my lung capacity by it being more compromised as I got older, if that kind of accelerated or hastened the progression. Is that possible?
So we have to make some just clarifications so that I give you the correct answer. So first question is, do you know that you have CMT2A? Or your question is more related to mitochondria because mitofusion is a mitochondrial protein?
Well, I've been diagnosed with CMT2A
Okay.
by my neurologist.
Okay. So in certain types of CMT, and 2A is one of them, you can develop scoliosis, and there's also a risk of developing weakness of your respiratory muscle, the diaphragm. So there are two things that could potentially affect your breathing. That's not necessarily related to the mitochondrial function in axons, which is because it's two different things. One is how our body capture oxygen and kind of have that oxygen go to the bloodstream and then to the cells, and then the cells will do something that we call cellular respiration, which is different than pulmonary respiration. So we know that mitofussion has a very important role in how mitochondria traffic, how mitochondria go through the cells, and how mitochondria function. But for what you're asking, I think your question has more to do with how CMT could be affecting your breathing capacity. And that, again, it's not specific for 2A. It can happen in other CMT subtypes, but needs to be determined, and there's ways to quantify more precisely how your breathing is being affected by your CMT. So things that we do in clinic when patients have this kind of symptom or complaint, one is to determine how severe the scoliosis is, depending on the angle or the degree of how your spine is kind of bending. Is more likely or less likely that this could impact the ability of your chest to expand and allow oxygen to go in. And the other thing is there are ways to also measure how strong your lungs or your respiratory muscles can make your lungs move air. And that's also important to capture oxygen and release CO2 or carbon dioxide. So my suggestion is to work with your neurologist or even your primary care physician, your internal medicine doctor, to have those two things assessed. So how severe scoliosis is, and also how potentially affected your respiratory muscles could be in terms of moving air. And there are ways that, and I mean, this is important because there are things that can be done to help you feel better from correcting the scoliosis, if there's a clear indication for that, but also using specific either breathing machines or things that will help with your breathing if there is a respiratory weakness. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I guess so. I was kind of also wondering, though, if my compromised lungs capacity, my pulmonologist calls it restrictive lung disease due to scoliosis. I just wondered if that could make the CMT progress faster.
Okay. In all likelihood, no. Because again, for your respiratory issue to be severe enough to affect your peripheral nerve biology, even having mitofussion mutation or CMT2A, you would have to be severely hypoxic, meaning you had to have severely low O2 levels, and I don't think that's the case if you're talking to me.
No.
So well. Yeah, so your CMT from a peripheral nerve perspective will progress irrespective of your breathing, but your breathing can cause secondary issues that may make your CMT feel worse. So fatigue, sleep disturbances, reduce exercise resistance. All of those are things that the breathing issue can cause that will affect how you feel in general, and also how you perceive your CMT, because sometimes people come to the clinic complaining of fatigue, and we have to break down and try to understand what's the mechanism of them feeling tired. Is that because their breathing is affected? Is that because they are using their muscles in such an intense way to compensate for like a foot drop, that they are really spending more energy than they would otherwise? So when we work with fatigue, as an example, in clinic, we have to do this kind of detective work to try to figure out what components of your CMT and secondary complications of CMT could be playing a role in your general well-being, and in this case, in your fatigue level. So again, I don't think that you should be concerned of your CMT progressing faster because of this breathing issue, but at the same time, this breathing issue has to be really well worked up and and corrected as much as possible so that you can have a better quality of life.
Thank you.
Sure. Yep.
Hi, my name is
Yep.
Chloe Spandersberg. I have a question.
Hi, Chloe.
I was wondering if there are any current treatments for CMT2A.
So currently there's no what we call disease modifying treatments, meaning something that could prescribe you that would change how your disease progresses. Hopefully we have a lot of people in this conference that are working specifically on different ways to make CMT2A better. Although I know it's kind of discouraging to hear that there are no current treatments, I think, and I'll try to convey this idea later today. I think we are in a very unique moment in CMT care and research, and we are really hopeful, and we believe that for a reason that we're going to start seeing those treatments coming along down the line. So, and this question it's a little bit tricky because when you ask me if there's a treatment for the CMT, my answer is always yes, because there are a lot of things, as I was just mentioning to Gloria, there are a lot of things that you can do that's not necessarily going to impact how your disease is behaving or progressing, but it will make you function better, feel better, and be able to live the life that you want to live. So in that sense, there's a lot that can be done for all kinds of CMT, and CMT2A included. But I know that your question is more related to a pill or an infusion or an injection that you could receive. And for that, we don't have anything currently available, but we are very hopeful that we will start seeing those treatments coming along soon.
I also had a second question. So I have lung compression because of neuromuscular weakness, and I actually wear a NIV every night. And I was wondering, is there anything that could be done to sort of reverse the neuromuscular weakness of the lungs?
So only once we have a treatment, we could start envision reversal of issues, right? So once you reach a point where your muscles are just not responding to your brain's command to function because of the neuropathy or the nerve dysfunction, we cannot reverse that from a kind of biological standpoint if we don't have something to treat the cause of the problem. We just making a parallel, we have another neuromuscular condition called spinal muscular atrophy, which is really the kind of the poster child of a successful therapy development process where within a span of a couple of years, of course, following decades of research, we now have 3 different therapies that are FDA approved for this condition. And it's also a genetic rare disease that affects the nerve cells. And we see even in adult patients improvement, if not complete reversal, but significant improvement in their function, including respiratory function with treatment. So I don't think it's impossible that once we have a treatment for CMT2A, that some of your symptoms could potentially not only stabilize, but even improve or reverse to a certain degree. But until we have something that we can use to treat CMT and CMT2A specifically, for now, what you can do is really use your NIV. Okay, and we had a question in the room.
So we've heard now from two patients about pulmonary complications. How frequent would you say that is? And is there any relationship to specific types of CMT where this becomes more common?
Yes. So I would say that really depends on how you define pulmonary dysfunction, because we know now that sleep, it's really a major domain affected by most CMT types, with sleep apnea or sleep disturbances being actually a pretty common occurrence. True respiratory, neuromuscular respiratory dysfunction is not that common in CMT. I would say probably less than 20%, even less than that, would have real respiratory weakness, as we see in other neuromuscular conditions. But there's a very strong genotype-phenotype correlation. So there are certain genes and mutations that will cause it way more frequent than others. So on a typical CMT1A patient, it's very unusual to see a patient with diaphragmatic weakness and need to use pressure support. But with patients with like GDAP1, which is a recessive type of CMT, with certain types of CMT1X, they can have not only diaphragmatic weakness, but also vocal cord weakness and paralysis, and that will affect their breathing. So CMT4C, so there are certain subtypes of CMT where this is more strongly associated. And in that particular population, the prevalence can go way higher than what I quoted. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Sure.
Everything I've read and what I trying to understand about this is that they sort of have more severe disease in their early childhood and potential level off. Do you find that to be true?
Yeah.
Given we have no marker in our family.
Of course, yeah. So there is actually a recent study that was done based on the data set from the Inherited Neuropathy Consortium that you guys have been listening about or hearing about this today, where they looked into a very large population of patients with CMT2A, and they tried to do that kind of estimation of what we call prognosis of the disease based on certain features. So one of the features that they determined was that if a patient with CMT2A develops symptoms very early in life, early childhood, they tend to have a more severe course in terms of how the CMT will affect them. But usually the bulk of progression will happen up to their 20s and then tends to stabilize. And even in those patients, life expectancy is not shortened, which I think it's reassuring. But at the same time, I would say that, how old is your kid again? 7. Yeah, so for a 7-year-old today, I would say that there's a very high likelihood that she would have access to treatment before getting to that kind of stage where, because what we're trying to do, it's understand, and we're only going to know for sure once we start having something to treat patients with, is how early do we need to intervene, or how late can we intervene and still make a difference. Again, taking from other diseases that are a little very similar to CMT because it's the same peripheral nervous system that's affected. It's also a problem with the nerve that causes muscle weakness. We're seeing that there, of course, there are differences of treating somebody that's completely asymptomatic before they develop symptoms and somebody that has very established disease. But even the ones that have very established disease, they show benefit from the treatment. So I think that there are a lot of open questions. But just to answer your question, yes, that's what you've been reading is true. That that actually is true for a lot of CMTs where you have this dichotomy of some mutations causing early disease and some mutations causing late disease. Is that the early initiating disease mutations will cause more severe disease, and the later onset mutations will cause a more stable disease or less severe. But again, I would not take that as, I know as a father and you as a mom that this is very, of course, concerning. But I think that within this her lifetime and the timeline that we are talking about, hopefully she will have not only one, but actually multiple ways to treat her CMT. Yeah. Let me just see if there's anything on the chat, because now I found the chat. So.
Hi, doctor. My
Yes.
name is ZK Chen.
Hello.
Hello. I had a friend. She is in the early 40s. About 20 some years ago, she had difficulty for walking. Both feet have issue, muscle weak, hard to control. And she did the nerve testing, found out it's inherited from her mother. Her mother had the same situation. The first question I'm wondering is already 20 some years and she's over in the early 40s. Is that treatable? That's our first question. The second question will be, is there anything she can do to help to, improve the situation?
Yeah, those are two great questions. So that the first one has to do with what we're just discussing. So we don't know yet because we never had a chance to treat a patient with CMT with something that would change the biology and the behavior of their disease. So we don't know how much we can hope for reversal of symptoms. But I think it's fair to expect that if we can intervene in the genetic cause of the disease, that at least the disease will stop progressing. But we will only be able to be sure about A and B is once we have that treatment that has been tested ideal on a clinical trial, and then we can see how patients responded to that treatment. Now, because the peripheral nervous system has a lot of plasticity, meaning it can regenerate, it can grow extra nerve fibers from the remaining nerve fibers that are still hanging around. There is a chance of improvement because you could potentially see that by giving the nervous system a chance to start working again in a physiological way, you could get that regeneration to help improve symptoms. And again, that's what we are seeing in other related conditions. But the real answer we will only know once we can start treating patients. Now, the second question is actually the most important one, because that's something that it's a common discussion clinic. I always tell my patients, now that we have so many programs, so many companies, so many foundations, academic institutions working in CMT, and in treatments and really seeing a perspective of treatments really starting to hit the clinic within the next decade, you have to really keep yourself at your best health. And that means being physically active, doing physical therapy and occupational therapy if there's a need for that. Some patients will require help to be able to use certain parts of their body that are just too weak. But it's very important to keep, for instance, their range of motion, how much movement they can, that the joints in their body can do even passively with somebody helping. Keeping a healthy diet, a healthy weight, good sleep. So all of the things that we hear our doctors telling us to do, and we know it's very hard to do, but it's important, and it's especially important for CMT because again, it has to do with how far away in the disease can we treat and see a benefit. And of course, if you have a patient that didn't take care of themselves, just gain a lot of weight, was not exercising, their muscles starting to really thin down and be replaced by fat, like we've seen this morning. Okay. The chance of a treatment to reverse that becomes way harder. On the other spectrum, if you have somebody that has been able to, through a lot of personal sacrifice and discipline, keep their diet as healthy as possible, being active, moving their body, making sure that they were working with a therapist to do stretchings and hand training. They will be way better off once the treatment becomes available, because at the least they will be stabilized at that high level of function.
Okay.
So that's kind of what we always suggest our patients to do is really prioritizing their health, if not for anything, just to keep themselves ready for the treatments that are coming along. The other two things that I always mention is making sure that they have their annual visit with their primary care physician to make sure that they're not developing diabetes or insulin resistance, because we know that if you add up diabetes to CMT, you can potentially make the CMT worse than it would be if the patient only had CMT. Make sure that the thyroid hormone levels are normal, that their vitamin B12 and the complex B vitamins are normal. Because if we can find anything that could make the CMT worse and that we can intervene, we should really focus on doing that, because again, we don't have other treatments to do, or to offer. So that's kind of the general recommendations that we give to patients. And as you see, there's a lot that they can do to feel better and to keep themselves healthier.
Okay, so lately she found some of the news. I think it's one of the PhD doctor, Lindy Shapiro, published something like a black pepper compound can help restore, the muscle things, for the CMT2A. Have you have any idea any other food or things will help?
So I imagine that could be curcumin. What was that? Oh, piperine. Oh, the compounds that they're presenting.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's still under investigation. We are not sure yet. We're hoping this is one of the major kind of leads in treatments for CMT2A, but we don't know yet, and it's definitely not going to be adding the pepper to the diet that will probably make the difference. It has to be something more purified and targeted. But if she likes spicy food and she doesn't have any contraindications to having it, I don't see a problem of her increasing her intake of that. But there is research, and there is definitely a very strong possibility that those compounds derived from pepper could potentially help treat CMT2A.
Yeah, is that and other different foods or vegetables, whatever you are familiar will help to improve the situation?
I'm sorry, I didn't get that.
I'm saying, is there any other food or vegetables will help to improve this situation? If
it's really having a healthy diet, which means having a good source of protein for the muscles, a good source of vitamins for her nerves. But there's no magic food that would change her CMT. It's really the whole balance of her diet.
Okay.
At least as far as we know.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
I was wondering if dysautonomia and I'm having some issues like temperature intolerance, and fast heart rate, and some other things like that. Are those common with CMT2A?
Not that common. So CMT is what we call a length-dependent neuropathy, meaning that the nerves that are more severely affected are nerves that are very long in length. So that's why you have the foot drop, the hand weakness. There is some symptoms that can mimic dysautonomia, but they're not necessarily dysautonomia as we conceive it. Meaning, if you have neuropathy that's severe enough in your feet or your hands, you can have this kind of that cold feeling or sensation of intolerance to certain temperatures, just because the blood flow to those areas are regulated by nerves. And if your nerves are not fully working, then you're going to have a hard time regulating that. But there are ways to determine if you have real dysautonomia, because it could theoretically potentially happen if your disease is severe enough and has progressed enough. And again, there are things that can be done to help with some of the dysautonomia symptoms. So I'll definitely discuss that with your neurologist, because that could be something that could, again, make your life better. I think we have 2 minutes left. So if anybody has any last kind of question.
I have a question.
Mhm.
I would like to know more about the fatigue aspect of CMT. Is
Yeah.
it because we're working, extra hard all the time to just walk and breathe, or is there something to do with the mitochondria that's causing the severe fatigue?
No, so again, fatigue is multifactorial, meaning there are different reasons for it, but we see them across the board. Even in CMTs, they're not mitochondria related, at least primarily. So it's a combination of the fact that, again, you're using your body in a very different way that it was designed to. So if you're not wearing braces, especially, you're basically using your hips, your thighs, a lot of muscles from your lower back to allow you to walk. So you're basically wasting or investing way more energy than other people would. There is the question, the issue that we already discussed of breathing being potentially affected. So that's something that always have to be considered as potentially a factor. As I mentioned before, sleep is now becoming more and more a area of study and investment in terms of identifying and correcting issues. So there are many reasons that a patient with CMT will be fatigued, and I'm surprised when fatigue doesn't comes up on the visit, because it's a very common complaint. And our job is identifying each one of those potential factors and trying to correct them as much as we can. And we can also should not forget the fact that if you're not exercising because of the CMT, you're also going to feel fatigued because you're not conditioned. You're not conditioning your body, your heart, your lungs to be able to keep a level of physical activity. So again, many reasons, and most of them we can do something about. So focus with your doctor to take care of those things. Okay.
Why doesn't sleep restore us? I think a lot of us wake up feeling as tired as we did when we go to bed. And I sleep as much as I can, but it doesn't seem restorative.
Yeah. So that could be because your sleep quality is not good enough to make you feel restored. So if you have sleep apnea, or if you have any other disturbance of sleep, even if you sleep 12 hours, you are actually sleeping maybe 2 hours of good quality sleep. And that's not going to be restorative. So identifying if those things are in play are important to care for it. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I think we have to finish.
Thank you, Dr. Saporta. Appreciate it very much.